Good evening, my loyal subjects, and welcome back inside the castle for another episode of Historia Mystoria. I am Professor Sponseller, and so glad you can join us once again as we now start taking a look at the original 13 colonies. That's right, tonight we're going to be taking a look at the differences and kind of compare and contrast the three different regions of the 13 colonies. Because yes, even though we are going to become one country eventually in 1776, we're going to talk about how did the people live here in the early to mid 1700s, and how did each of the regions of our 13 colonies kind of generate their own wealth and be able to survive on their own. And so we'll take a look and get started right into it here this evening. And again, we're going to examine the similarities and differences between the three colonial regions, but you do have to understand what are the original 13 colonies. Many people get these confused, and so we'll go over them very quickly here to begin. First, what we consider in the New England colonies, we have New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, as you can see here. And we'll add in Massachusetts. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the state of Maine, that we know it today in the northeast part of our country, was actually part of Massachusetts at that time. Maine was not an original 13 colony, even though it was located in the New England region. Of course, we have the big state of New York, also Rhode Island, and of course Connecticut and Pennsylvania, which we've already seen. All right, then we have New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, the big state of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and of course Georgia. These were your original 13 colonies. And so now we're going to break them down into their original kind of regions and what we knew them as, and what did they do to create an income and wealth to be able to sustain themselves throughout the 1700s. So to start off with, we'll discuss the New England colonies. Of course, gets the name for the fact that most of these Protestants who came here, we learned from the last scenario, came here as Puritans and considered, to be wanting to purify and simplify the church. And of course, we understand that they called this region New England for the fact that most of them came from Great Britain, obviously. All right. And then in the south, all right, what we call the southern region or the southern colonies, we have Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And then, of course, you have your middle colonies, and we'll have a nickname for them here as we go throughout this lesson as well, and that's New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. All right, so let's start off with, just like we did when we kind of gave you the colonies here, we'll go ahead and start off with the New England colonies. Farming was very difficult. We go back to, when the people of the separatists, the Pilgrims came in, and we understood that they weren't able to farm because they weren't expected to be there. They were expected to be in the south, and they didn't really know how to farm in the northeast. We know that it is full of rocky soil. We understand that it's full of long winters and full of forests, very thick forests, for example. And so with these three things, it's very difficult to farm as if you could farm somewhere in Pennsylvania, Virginia, or even North Carolina, for that matter. And so what was it that made New England so able to literally become the largest area in our country at its earliest stages? Of course, it became the earliest manufacturing part of our country as well, and that was easily done by fishing and trade. Yes, fishing was going to be very, very important. Again, most people lived on the coastline in the New England colonies, and therefore fishing would become a huge wealth income manager for the New England colonies. And with that comes this example, and I want to kind of throw this example out there to you guys to show you how did jobs and population become so prevalent in the Northeast and the New England colonies. It's because of the fishing industry. But when you think about it, think about all the things that have to go in to fishing. All right, you also have to have other things that help you fish. And so to have a great fishing industry, you must have obviously ships to go out and fish on. And so there were shipbuilders that were needed. You also had to have the lumber to build the ships and to make other things you need for fishing. And so you would have the lumbering. Of course, that is full with the thick forests in the Northeast. Also, you have barrel making and sail making. Barrel making, of course, to hold the fish, sail making to make your ship run. And so all these things would have to have people working, and it created jobs. And so there were more people needed in the Northeast, and therefore a lot of people went to the more manufacturing areas so they could get these jobs. Okay, of course, the next thing would be metalworking, obviously things for rivets for the ship and for, whatever you needed for, in regards to nets and things like that. All of this stuff needed for the fishing industry would also help to create jobs. And so the issue was, remember that most people in North America, or in this case, what we know as the United States, did not have the skills needed. They were coming from places, this is the second generation, they really weren't sure how to do a lot of these things, and so there were a few who were. And so many people would have to learn to become apprentices. And of course, an apprentice is someone who works under a master for a certain amount of time to learn a trade or a craft. And then as they learn, then they can go off on their own and get these jobs as well. And so you would see this happen all the time in the 1700s, especially in the Northeast. We'll head on to the middle colonies now, and this is probably by far one of the most we don't talk about the middle colonies all that much because of what they were into, what they were responsible for. But what we would consider the middle part of our country today, we call the Plain States of Nebraska, Iowa. We know that they were all about farming, and that's exactly what the middle colonies were during that time period. The middle of our country, or the middle of the 13 colonies, was all about farming. It was originally settled, New York was, by the Dutch. We'll get to that in a later episode here on Historia Mystoria. We've already talked about Pennsylvania and the fact that it was created by the Quakers. We understood about how they were all about grain and oats and different things like that. Well, Pennsylvania is eventually going to be kind of settled by a new group of people who are coming from kind of the middle part of Europe, German-speaking Protestants known as the Pennsylvania Dutch, and they're going to kind of run the Quakers out. And so Pennsylvania kind of loses its identity as a Quaker colony, turns over to a Pennsylvania Dutch colony, but it still remains, right, the largest and most prominent farming colony of the 13 colonies. Things like grain and wheat and barley and rye and all the things you need in regards to farming, that happened in the middle colonies. And so it quickly gained the nickname the breadbasket colonies. For obvious reasons, all these things would be going into what we would consider making bread. And so the breadbasket colonies, or the middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, were all about farming. We'll move on now to the southern colonies, and you can see that it was a lot different. It too was farming, but much different because the soil and the climate were perfect for certain things. We already talked about tobacco when we talked about Jamestown and the fact that the Indians were able to help out by showing them how to cultivate the tobacco. You also had things like indigo. They would use the dye from that plant to color things. But the biggest thing I want you to understand from the southern colonies was all of this was done on huge plantations, huge plots of land that were owned by southern white proprietors. And of course, the people working on these plantations were slaves. And so they were able to use all money. Nothing was coming out of pocket. You didn't have to pay any labor. And so the South was actually the ones that were making the most money. You would think that like today it would be in the Northeast, but back then the South was the money maker for the 13 colonies. And that's why they were by far the most important of the 3 regions of the 13 colonies. All right, and so they used slave labor to accumulate all of this wealth, and of course most people in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and eventually become the cotton fields as we move forward into our history as well. And so you have to understand that even though, yes, most people were dreaming of living in the Northeast, the money was coming from the South. So even though the population was not nearly what it was in the North, the South still had the wealth at this time period. Keep that in mind, as that's going to play a major role as we get into the pre-revolution, and even once we get past the revolution and getting into the Civil War. All right, if you don't like, again, there's the definition for a plantation: a large estate farmed by many workers. It's a huge plot of land, and we'll be talking more about this as we move forward all the way up through the Civil War. All right, well, oh, shoot, I always do that. Well, that'll just about wrap up our show here on Historia Mystoria. A very quick lesson on the 13 colonies here of the early New World and of all the Protestants and early Americans who were traveling here to this country. And next time here on Historia Mystoria, we'll talk about a couple of the major cities like New York City, which wasn't quite New York City at that time. And we'll also discuss a little bit about the trade routes between North America, even South America, the West Indies, and of course, even over into Europe. And so I hope you learned something today. Make sure you have completed everything on your NOMIA assignments. And as always, if you're not earning, you're not learning. And we'll see you next time here on Historia Mystoria.